folks. It's TMBS 165. Jeremy Corbyn reinstated, or the importance of defending the left during infighting. I'm Matt Leck. With me is Leisha Brooks.
Hello, hello.
David Griscom.
How's it going?
It's going pretty well. Feeling pugnacious today.
I love that word.
No, I'd say. We're also going to be talking about some infighting on this side of the pond, and why it's also good to defend the left and fight the centrists particularly when they start beef. But even when you have to start it, I think, stop being afraid of conflict, folks. Conflict is the least of our worries at this point. And updates on south of the equator as well. David, Alicia, how are you guys doing today?
I always think about what I'm going to say during this time. And there's always like 20 things I want to tell you both. And then you ask me and my mind just goes blank. It's a curse. I've definitely been feeling just really, really, really sad. Both obviously for the reason we all know, but also just, I don't know, I've been feeling really Twilight Zone-y with just the amount of excitement that a lot of people kind of in my broader social bubble, Black Mirror thing have, and just out in the streets, it feels like this, my little like hipster gentrified neighborhood, like, oh, thank God we're saved, it's all over. And it really is kind of taking a toll on me psychologically, because it's like really scary to me.
No, it's definitely a tough time. And actually, no, I'm so sorry. I was just thinking something that might be a funny behind the scenes thing to share with people. Whenever, Michael would introduce us and would, say something to everybody, the first couple times I was like on mic, I was extremely nervous and I wasn't able to figure out what to say. So I started just going with like, how's it going? Right. Which is what my thing. And Michael would always get mad at me for doing that, because it would throw him off his game, because he was like trying to set himself up to do a monologue or something like that. And I just asked him how it's going. And he would ask me not to do it. So then one time I tried something else just off the cuff, and I just like panicked, which is insane. But I just panicked, and I just was like, and he's just like, here's David Griscom, and I was just like, good night. So I still have to stick with the how's it going, because you don't know what's going to come out of my mouth if I don't do it. It's my comfort phrase.
That's so funny. Yeah, I guess I've fallen into hello, which is a little bizarre as well.
I was going to say it is a classic 7:10 start, just like the old days.
Yeah, that's true.
That reminds me of like one time when I was working, I was installing a little bit of a sidebar, but I was installing a communications wire in a hospital, and there was this woman in the radiology department I would see like occasionally, and the sort of thing where you're saying, hi, how are you going, and then just keep going about your day. And she said hey, but I thought she was going to say how's it going, and so I said not bad, how are you, to hey. See you later.
Yeah, that's always you need to slink away.
Man. What do we got today, David?
Yeah, well, I just want to plug again, later tonight we're going to have an interview with Paul O'Connell, which is very, very enlightening about what's happening in the UK. So definitely be prepared for that. And it was interesting because I was working on this commentary beforehand, but we ended up touching on a few of the same themes, which is like during the interview I was talking to him about, sometimes talking about the UK can be a little bit difficult for me, just because it reminds me of how excited we were like 2 years ago, when there was this moment where a lot of people on the left, and like, maybe we were over enthusiastic, but, I don't blame us too much for being hopeful. But there was this moment when we really believed that, neoliberalism was on its last breath, and, we were going to have a Bernie Sanders presidency and possibly a Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And now we're in this very difficult position right now where not only were we not successful, but neoliberalism is very much, feeling ascendant. But I wanted to look at what's happening right here in the US and, make a couple of really important analyses, because yes, Joe Biden, won this election, and, Bernie Sanders was defeated, but don't have any illusions. This election did not put anything away. The coalition that they were able to build in the Democratic Party, which yes did win, but was very unimpressive, especially for historic turnout, is not something that is going to knock out the GOP, in the long term, like some people were really hoping. In fact, the math is looking really bad, and it's going to be a very difficult 2 years. For the Democratic Party, just because of how badly they failed at picking up the seats that they needed to pick up and held defending seats. And on top of that, we've seen them completely retreat from some of the rhetorical moves that they were putting forward. For example, against Bernie Sanders, that this kind of centrist, more corporate wing of the Democratic Party was more attuned with the interests and needs of minorities in this country. And what did we see in this most recent election was that it was a triumphant moment for wealthy and white suburbs. And those people are not loyal. I mean, hell, all those voters who ended up voting for Biden, a lot of them voted Republican down ballot. That's why this was such a down ballot disaster. These people are not loyal to the party at all. And, there's no, there certainly is no promise that we're in this kind of situation where now, the Democratic Party was basically able to slay the dangerous dragon of the GOP. I mean, that's a complete fantasy.
Grover Norquist is licking his chops at all those new wealthy Democrats.
Yeah, and it's significantly dangerous going forward because what that coalition does represent is not one that is clamoring for dynamic and radical change, the kind of radical change that we need. And as people are very familiar with who are watching this show, the narrative since this election has been that it's actually the more radical side of the Democratic Party, that it's the AOCs, the Democratic Socialists, the Justice Democrats are what cost, the Democratic Party a down ballot, when, the reality of it from what we're seeing actually is that they were courting a group of people that has no loyalty to the Democratic Party. And we're just happy to vote Joe Biden at the top of the ticket because they didn't like the kind of cultural politics of Donald Trump anymore. And I just want to read real quick from an article in Politico that was sort of going through this infighting that we're seeing, where Representative Abigail Spanberger, a blue dog Democrat from Virginia, warned colleagues on a private call after the election that no one should say defund the police ever again. AOC rejected that criticism on Sunday, and this is her quote. When we kind of come out swinging, not 48 hours after Tuesday, and we don't even have solid data yet, pointing fingers and telling each other what to do, it deepens the division in the party, and it's irresponsible. It's irresponsible to pour gasoline on what is already very delicate tensions in the party. And I've got to say, as somebody who, has significant criticisms of AOC, though I think that she is an incredible ally and has done a lot for the left in this country, I've really appreciated seeing her fight back against all these nonsense attacks on the left. Because it's very clear that the party itself is not going to try to push back against these kind of more blue dog criticisms of the left. And they're going to, if not, step in and, tell those people that they need to be quiet. They're actually allowing the space for them to make these completely unsubstantiated claims that what cost all of these boring Democrats their seats was the left, when in fact, people who were running, who were supporting things like Medicare for all, they were winning their elections, right? It was actually like the centrists who were really having difficulty in this most recent election. This kind of false narrative out there that it was like the left that cost Joe Biden, what was supposed to be a slam dunk election.
Right.
It's despicable. And
I don't mean to cut you off. Do you remember this story with the new squad? These five freshman congressmen changed history by becoming unlikely leaders of impeachment, and it was all like, I think Spamberger might have even been one of them. I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe.
But like the media is loaded to propagandize for that wing, right? And they need it, frankly, because like in a truly fair battlefield of ideas, they can't really win, but the advantages are so massive on institutional level. And this is, perpetual. You look at the New York Times, what they were talking about abolitionists back then, right? Like, like this is what the press in large part has been set up to do. It's one of its goals. So.
Yeah. And I would just add too that I would reject the claim that it was any kind of more radical messaging that was hurting the Democrats in this most recent election. But there's something that needs to be said about articulating and fighting for policy ideas that might not be initially popular, but that you're able to convince people. Hell, that's what Bernie Sanders did for a long time, was completely shift people's perspectives as to what is possible. But Matt, do you have this clip handy? Because I think Anna in last Saturday's weekends really hit this message on the head, where it's going to be interesting to see where the Democratic Party goes, because despite the fact that they were, trying to push up this rhetoric that they were this radical party fighting for social justice, now on the other side of the election, they're completely running away from, that messaging, even at a symbolic level.
Yeah, it's interesting because here in the United States, the Democratic Party has really latched onto identity politics and cultural issues in order to do the majority of their campaigning. It gives them the ability to completely ignore the economic injustice that most workers are experiencing right now and have some message, right? So, of course, with Biden, there was this message of decency, which is a strange message to have when you have, this constant fear mongering about the right wing. It's like, oh, they're terrible. They're going to destroy you. They're going to destroy your life. But we need to be decent. We're going to bring back decency with all these people who are accusing you of being pedophiles, right? With no evidence whatsoever. It's the most insane message. I don't think that message was effective. I think that Donald Trump being a disaster with the pandemic is what helped elect Biden. But now we're also getting this weird pivot within congressional Democrats regarding messages of racial injustice, right? They want to now completely abandon messages regarding racial injustice. And so on one hand, you have this hyper focus on cultural issues, which they've always been incredibly shallow about. They've never actually wanted to do anything to improve the lives of various minority groups throughout the country. But they used it for a campaign tool and campaign messaging. And now I just don't know. This is more a statement than a question. I just don't know what they plan on campaigning on moving forward.
Yeah, and I think she's 100% right. And it's so funny to remember that this is the party, when Hillary Clinton said to Bernie Sanders about Medicare for all, how's that going to, solve systematic racism in this country? That now those people ostensibly are in power, that wing of the Democratic Party. And their initial message after the election was that all of this, social unrest and people fighting for racial justice in this country against police brutality is what cost them their majority.
Yeah, if there was anything in response to the Black Lives Matter protests that cost the Democrats politically, I'd say it was probably stuff like this. If you are just gonna throw these issues overboard the second that the election's over, don't you know photographs last forever?
And
I still just get lethargic when I see that.
Yeah, it was ridiculous. And look, here's the kind of the punch of this argument, though. It's we all know this story. We all know exactly what the Democratic Party is. It's an organization that is set up. It's a structural organization in the United States state to try to prevent any kind of radical left-wing movement from growing and coming into power. These people very much are in our opposition, and we need to get serious about confronting them and fighting them, because literally just left to their own devices, actually, they will just let this whole system rot. They will just let us all continue to rot and suffer, not only on the horrors that we were already living under before the COVID crisis, but especially now. So, what do we need to do? We have to do the real serious work. And I'm sorry to sound like a broken record on this, but we have to start building and deepening our political organizations in this country. I know there's a lot of people who get excited, myself included, about the potential of a left-wing workers' party, one day being able to develop in this country. That's something that I 100% support. But we need to avoid this kind of fantasy thinking that some people, I think, fall into, that if we just come up with this proper slogan and a good branding and a proper logo, then we're just going to be able to have a third party in this country. The only time we've ever had left-wing socialist movements, left movements that have been viable and have been able to last and have significant impacts on politics have been when they literally organically come out of the communities. I'm talking about the populist movement. These were farmers who were being abused by our financial system and by the merchant class and by the wealthy in the society. And they started to get together and to talk about what was affecting them and why they were hurting. And through that, they were able to develop a political program and were able to, put pressure on elected officials and start to build a political consciousness that eventually became the populist movement. And then that became the People's Party, which then, developed into what became the Socialist Party in the United States, right? That came out of an organic movement. And the way to think about it is like, we're not going to have the party until we've built the people. Like, until we build like a political class that is conscious of themselves, we're not going to be able to step into any kind of, viable political movement. We have to start building that consciousness. And there's a lot of different ways to do it. That's, obviously, big, deep arguments within organizations like the DSA about how to do that. But we have to be doing two things. One, fighting for people today as well as we can. And two, starting to articulate the significant differences between our politics, AOC's politics, and Nancy Pelosi's politics, because it's a toxic brand. And it's also the Democratic Party in general is an organization that working class people are rightfully suspicious of, because they've spent their entire lives having to vote defensively, because they go into the polling place not thinking about how can I better my life, how can I prevent it from getting worse. We have to be able to develop that consciousness. We really need to dive back deep into labor politics, community organizing, not in a way to like return to the shadows. We can never do that again. We're building up these kind of platforms right now through media and social organizations, but we just have a lot of work to be done. And we just need to start thinking about us as engaging in that work too, instead of just thinking that one day everyone's just going to wake up and there's just going to be this rupture and some new viable political party is going to rise.
Yeah, I think that sort of be nice. It would be nice. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, that sort of thinking, I think, is pretty prevalent in all tendencies. Like, it's not just like a left pathology, but it's not in the ones that win, I guess.
And it's like, look at Moss in Bolivia. Like, not only were they able to come back into power after this horrific coup, but now we'll talk about a little bit later what's going on in Bolivia today. Now they're actually already being able to engage in, significant reforms in the kind of politics that we need to do. And they didn't just do that because they had the right charismatic leader, right? They did that because they had deep enough social organizations that even with the military and the United States arm of imperialism, they were able to survive and be able to reclaim their previous victories. Like, that's the kind of social movements that we need, that we're missing right now, because we had that with Bernie Sanders, that so many people were mobilizing, getting engaged in politics, and we did a really significant job at like proving to people that we can build a different kind of politics in this country. But now we're in this moment where, okay, where do we go next, right? And that's what happens when you don't have those kind of deep social movements that we can just walk back into. Like, we actually have to do a really difficult job of building those up from scratch in a lot of places.
Yeah, and I think about, like, you mentioned the good work AOC's been doing, but ultimately, like, it's how much success we see from her office isn't contingent on her as a heroic figure. It's going to be everything surrounding her that is able to push her and that she's able to ride and actually deliver for us. So yeah, I think there's far too much placed on these individuals as heroic actors, and they need a lot more support than they have, frankly.
All right, well, looking towards that, are we ready for this first interview?
Yeah.
That we have? I might set it up a little bit, unless you have.
No, I'm ready.
I was just going to set this up a little bit because Paul and I pre-recorded this earlier this afternoon, and as we were recording, the news came out that Jeremy Corbyn had been reinstated into the Labour Party. And he had to do it in a way, unfortunately, he didn't come out, full out apologize necessarily, but he basically had to take a step back. It's something that, look, I'm happy for Jeremy Corbyn. I think the attacks on him are disgusting. So I'm personally happy about this news. But it's unfortunately, it's not something that we can really celebrate, because what we've seen is just Keir Starmer and the Blairite wing of the Labour Party, the right wing of the Labour Party, being able to really assert their power, not just against Jeremy Corbyn, but also the left wing that still remains in the Labour Party. And we talk about it a little bit in the interview. I don't want to give too much away, but there has been a significant loss of membership in the Labour Party because of what they've been doing over these past few months that Starmer's been in power. So we'll start with this, but I also want to read real quick, because I asked Paul O'Connell if there's anything that he wanted to add. to his analysis given this, and this is what he said to me. It's a Pyrrhic victory. To be reinstated from an entirely baseless suspension, Corbyn had to apologize and more or less retract a statement of incontestable fact. This weakens the left, support for Palestine, etc., going forward, and has allowed Starmer and the center to show the weakness of the left in the party. The celebrations, while understandable in one respect, also show how low expectations have become, from wanting to transform society to being grateful for being kicked. And on that,
ouch. Yeah, Paul's keeping it real.
Yeah, he always keeps it real. But yeah, we have this for y'all coming up right now.
All right, here it is, folks.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm joined here by Paul O'Connell, who teaches law at the SOAS, University of London, and he's also a political activist, a good friend of the show. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul.
Thanks, David. Good to see you.
So we got a lot to get into here. So just for people who might just be jumping into this conversation for the first time, I highly suggest you go back and watch a video we did a couple of weeks ago with Daniel Finn, where we went in depth into the allegations against Jeremy Corbyn and basically his suspension. But if you were to just sort of, for somebody who might not know what's going on, sort of, paint that broadly as to what happened to Corbyn, and then specifically what's happened in these past few weeks since the suspension.
Yeah, so I think many of your listeners and viewers might be aware that for a number of years now, there's been a protracted campaign within Britain of insinuating and alleging systemic anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and anti-Semitism on behalf of Jeremy Corbyn as an individual, and more generally criticising Corbyn as a facilitator or as a magnet for anti-Semites. It got to absurd proportions where you had otherwise so respectable and reasonable human rights lawyers and media commentators referring to the Labour Party as an existential threat to the Jewish community in Britain. And in advance of the last election, you had the sort of running meme of the idea of if Corbyn's Labour won, where were people going to run to? Where would Jews feel safe leaving the country and so forth? So it was an entirely exaggerated and cynically weaponized campaign alleging anti-Semitism. Now, this shouldn't need saying, but I'll say it anyway. There is, of course, anti-Semitism as a massive societal problem, and within the Labour Party and on the left. But in realistic terms, it's a minuscule percentage of the Labour Party's membership. But because of the nature of this campaign and this sort of relentless alleging of anti-Semitism, the public perception was that the Labour Party was rife with anti-Semites. That I think public perception was that about a third of the Labour Party membership were anti-Semites. Now, the causes for this, so where this campaign comes from, there are various sort of tributaries that feed into it. One of them is, of course, the Labour right, who cynically used Corbyn's response to the sort of Novichok attack in England when Corbyn refused to come out and call for a war on Russia and said we should look for the evidence first. So then he was a Russian stooge, and he was a friend of the IRA, and he was a friend of Hamas and Hezbollah, and he's an Islamophobe. So it was one of a whole range of things they were willing to throw at him. That was part of it, was the Labour right cynically deploying it. Also the right within Britain in general. So the sort of right-wing newspapers that daily publish anti-migrant, Islamophobic trash, as a matter of course, were coming out waxing lyrical about the racism of Corbyn and co, and how this was aberrant. And then there was definitely part of an Israeli state lobby in the UK that there's video footage and other evidence to show that they were campaigning to undermine Corbyn. And that's, again, very obvious strategic reasons for that. The idea of the leader of the main opposition party in Britain, potentially a future prime minister in Britain, being somebody who recognised the state of Palestine and the rights of the Palestinian people, was obviously anathema to the interests of the Israeli state itself. So there are all these different factors that fed into it. The campaign has raged on for 4 years. Unfortunately, the left, most of the left within Labour and in Britain, let's call it the soft left in a general sense, capitulated in the face of this, rather than recognising that they were in a fight and that this wasn't a good faith engagement with a genuine issue. They kept on rowing back and accepting the criticisms and going, yes, this is a serious problem and it has to be dealt with. And that then just fed the fire of the allegations around anti-Semitism. So a formal investigation was launched by a statutory body called the Equality and Human Rights Commission due to complaints against the Labour Party. Now, they've also had complaints made to them about racism within the Conservative Party, but they've yet to launch a formal investigation on the Conservatives, who, by any objective measure, are the most structurally racist party in Britain, compared to Labour in that sense. But the EHRC haven't deigned to investigate them yet. So the EHRC conducted this investigation, and again, the sort of vitriol and outlandish claims about Corbyn and so forth continued in the media. The report was published, I guess, 5 or 6 weeks ago at this stage, and the substantive report itself is fairly unremarkable. It finds that there were some procedural failings in terms of how Labour dealt with anti-Semitism allegations, mainly the product of incompetence and sometimes of overzealousness and people wanting to appear to be doing more on the issue. It didn't say anything about Corbyn. It didn't declare him an existential threat to the Jewish community in Britain. It didn't find anything of the sort, but it did find failings on behalf of Labour institutionally and how it dealt with these complaints. And the same day the report was published, Corbyn understandably issued a response to the report, because again, he understood the context in which it was made and he accepted the terms of the report and the conclusions completely, but also made the point that some of his political opponents and some people had exaggerated the extent of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party for political purposes. This is an objective fact that can't be contested. Anybody who's paid attention for the last 4 years can see this. Labour's new leader, Keir Starmer, who's in the process of making the Labour Party safe again as a sort of junior party for the management of British capital, took this opportunity to suspend Corbyn and suspended Corbyn via the General Secretary of the party, suspended Corbyn summarily on the day. I understand Corbyn found out about a second hand from a journalist. He wasn't even informed directly. Corbyn is still suspended at the moment. There's a tentative grassroots campaign amongst Labour members and the broader left to support Corbyn. I stand with Jeremy Corbyn, reinstate Jeremy Corbyn. Unfortunately for him, his own socialist colleagues within the Labour Party have been less stalwart in this regard. So the Socialist Campaign Group, which is the main body within the Parliamentary Labour Party, Corbyn is a member of it, John MacDonald and a number of other people who loosely claim the label socialist. They issued a statement calling for Corbyn to be reinstated, but other than that have shown no real appetite to fight for Corbyn's reinstatement. Corbyn himself has remained silent until today, as it happens, where he's come out to issue a clarification, which is a step down in a way from his initial statement, and may or may not be part of a sort of ad hoc negotiation to get him readmitted into the party. That remains to be seen, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, and I just think it needs to be stated again, especially, for people in our U.S. audience too, to understand just how, severe these allegations were. I mean, as you noted earlier, that the general public understanding of what was happening within the Labour Party was that there was like a third of the membership, had been found guilty of engaging in anti-Semitism. Yeah. So, Corbyn's statement that he made when he got suspended, the first like 3/4 of it are all him just saying that, I'm glad the results have come out and we want to implement what we need to do to make sure that we fight against this cancer that is anti-Semitism. And then basically he just says, like, honestly, not even like a full-throated defense of himself, just says, look, this has also been used by our opponents to attack us. Yeah. And that is the justification that we've gotten from, or not even, because they're not very clear actually about why exactly, but that's been the insinuation that his like very, almost timid, defense of himself was an example of why he needed to be purged from the party.
Yeah. I mean, that is another point actually. So again, I think when I was on with you guys a few months back and talking about the likely consequences of the Labour leadership election, that Starmer was most likely to win, and that once he won, Starmer would have a mandate, not from the membership as such, but a mandate from the power brokers within the party to restore the party to what it had been, to sort of push it back towards the respectable face of new Labourism, respectable from the perspective of British capital and the British ruling class. And this is part of that process. So there was Rebecca Long-Bailey was suspended. She was initially appointed to Starmer's shadow cabinet. She was one of the only half decent shadow ministers in Starmer's cabinet when the COVID crisis first broke. She was supporting the education trade unions when they were pushing back against the government's plans to reopen schools. Starmer, of course, which has been his policy from the start, was completely acquiescing in everything the government was asking for. I think he imagines himself in some sort of government of national unity in the middle of a war, just sort of trying to play the sort of national interest card. But Rebecca Long-Bailey completely innocuously shared an interview with Maxine Peake, who's a British actress and political activist. And Maxine Peake made a couple of statements about the relationship between the oppression of the Palestinians in Palestine and what was happening around the George Floyd issue. What's interesting there is that's their links that activists make as well. You might remember in Ferguson, after the murder in Ferguson a few years back, Palestinian activists were sending via social media advice to activists in Ferguson on how to protect themselves from tear gas, and they were linking it up also with activists in Turkey in Gezi Park, because the same US company made the tear gas canisters that were being fired in Ferguson in Palestine and in Gezi Park. So people were making these links anyway. Anyhow, Maxine Peake made this general statement about how the repressive tactics of the police in the US were similar to and taken over from what they'd seen in Israel. Now, you know better than I, and anybody living in the US knows that the US police don't need training in brutality from anyone, that they're very capable of it themselves, but they do. There are strong links between the Israeli armed forces and the Israeli repressive apparatuses and various US police departments. Maxine Peake might have been slightly inaccurate in what she said, but the gist of what she said was true. This was challenged as anti-Semitism, and because Rebecca Long-Bailey had shared this tweet, that was claimed to be anti-Semitism, and then she apologized for it. And this again is this problem of conceding it, this problem of imagining you're in a good faith conversation and debate with people about trying to address the issue of anti-Semitism when it's actually just a cynical weaponization of it. So with Corbyn now, it still hasn't been made clear, and I think he's been suspended 4 or 5 weeks, and it still hasn't been made clear on what basis. I'm assuming it's bringing the party into disrepute. I'm assuming it's something like that, which is a vague catch-all phrase which you can use to justify a suspension, but really wouldn't stand up to any sort of serious scrutiny in due course. But as I said, he's made this statement today that may lead to his reinstatement. If it does lead to his reinstatement, it'll be very much a Pyrrhic victory, because the campaign that Corbyn and others are pushing is that he should be reinstated and the Labour Party should move forward around the ERC report and the IHRA definition of what anti-Semitism is. And this would be a dreadful move, because this definition of anti-Semitism basically conflates any criticism of the state of Israel and its many crimes with anti-Semitism. And so in terms of the chilling effect that could have on anti-imperialist and sort of socialist politics in Britain, it's really, really concerning. I'm sure you're aware of this, but recently a young woman who was elected onto Labour's NEC, the Jewish Chronicle, which is a sort of right-wing publication that was pursuing this campaign against Corbyn and Labour. The young woman was elected, and they dug up a tweet of hers from 2 or 3 years ago, I'm guessing when she was 18, where she said, Israel is an apartheid state and I don't care, I'm just going to say that. So now the complaints have been made about this, presumably that it's anti-Semitism. But again, it's one of those things that it's factually correct. Israel is an apartheid state. And the UN in 2017 has said this. Israeli human rights groups like the NGO B'Tselem issued a report in 2019, so just late last year, saying that the Israeli state had implemented an apartheid regime. The basic law, the nation state basic law that was passed in 2018 explicitly makes Israeli Jews as like the superior class within the Israeli state and so forth. So it is an apartheid state on any objective metrics. Because this young woman has said it now, it's automatically suspect because of how the IHRA definition has been weaponized in the way in which it has.
Yeah, I mean, it's so ridiculous that that we're still having to have this debate, about what's going on in Israel, because it's horrific, and it's not even just a legacy anymore. I mean, it's like quite, it's ongoing. The abuses of Palestinian people, but I wanted to make this point clear and start to get actually into how Keir Starmer has been able to use this now to gain more control of the party. It should be noted for people who might not be familiar, but there have been significant reports that have come out that have shown that under Corbyn's leadership, you had Labour Party members, Labour Party executives and leaders actively undermining the Labour Party. And, in horrific ways, in a sense that probably could have cost him, the general election, his first general election. And even with all of this resistance that you saw within the Labour Party in this time, there wasn't really this massive purge from, Corbyn didn't do this massive purge of all these kind of Blairites and all these people who were fighting against his program. But what we've seen in the short stint of Keir Starmer's leadership, he's been able to use this anti-Semitism claim, and especially over these past few weeks, to really push back against the Labor left. What you were just mentioning about Gemma Bolton, for sure. And then also there have, what was going on in Bristol West in their constituency, Labour Party, that you had another round of suspensions for people, again, just coming out with fairly honestly like timid defense of Corbyn in the situation. Wanting to debate it.
They've been suspended because the General Secretary of the Labour Party and the Labour Party's leadership line was that an ongoing disciplinary case, the case of Corbyn, should not be discussed by CLPs. And again, the activists in Bristol West absolutely rightly pushed back against that and passed a motion at an emergency general meeting to have a discussion about and to criticise the way in which Corbyn had been treated. And I can't remember the exact number, but 3 or 4 members have now been suspended. It's the thing is that these people who brought this motion, and they were right to do so, but they don't have the backing and the support of the main nodes of left Labourism. So Momentum has been very timid on this. They issued a statement that they support Corbyn, but again, they talk about rallying around the EHRC report and moving forward together. The SCG has been the exact same. Now, there are deep-seated reasons for this. And again, it's part of the, again, I think I might have discussed this with you and Michael previously, but within the British tradition, within what's known as Labourism, there are various sort of tenets that make up this view of politics. And one of them is the idea of party unity. But it's only ever the left of the party that believes in this delusion. The right of the party has no qualms about it. And if they'd paid attention for the last 5 years, they would have seen that the right of the party was happy to burn the thing down to the ground in order to get rid of Corbyn and then sort of, rule over whatever was left. But the main thing was to get rid of Corbyn. Whereas the left feels that they have to conform, that they have to not rock the boat and so forth. And so they've been very timid. And this group in Bristol West was an exception to that. And now you've seen Starmer and the people around them and the Labour machine, the charges of Stalinism that were thrown at Corbyn and the people around them when they were the most mild, timid social democrats you could ever come across, whereas the right now coming in. And again, it's one of those things that the right of the Labour Party, the one merit that they really have is that they've got no illusions about the sort of politics they're involved in. They understand what they're doing, and they're ruthless about it, and they push it forward, and they won't back off, and they won't sort of compromise and say, okay, we're on the same team, let's not go too far. They'll use the language of unity, and Starmer did that. He pitched himself as a unity candidate, and it was always a nonsense. If you knew a fraction of anything of the man's record and the substantive politics that he supported over the years, you knew it wasn't true. But it's still the line they push. But in practical terms, they are clearing house. They're making the Labour Party safe once again to be a sort of backup party of government as and when the option arises.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting as well too. Like, even if Corbyn is reinstated after what we've seen these past few weeks, I mean, he'll be returning into a party that has, had like a very serious reckoning, where you have seen, this kind of clampdown on like any kind of opposition. I mean, members of a party trying to defend, their former leader, 4.5 years. It should not be something that is just so distasteful to the leadership of the party that you can't, do that. And I'd be curious as to, what your read on this now is, because, what was so exceptional of the Corbyn years is that they really did a lot to democratize the party and to make it more participatory and bring in more people into the party apparatus. I mean, how significant do you think this chilling effect has been over these past few weeks? And then also, I guess, maybe, more broadly over this, stint of Starmer's leadership?
Yeah, so again, I think it's one of those things that I think there's two parts to it. On the one hand, Corbyn and the sort of, let's call it the Corbyn moment, because again, it's one of those things. It requires an awful lot of unpacking, but you don't get Corbyn without the economic crisis of 2008 that began to unfold, and you don't get Corbyn without also getting Brexit. All of this was part of the structural crisis of capitalism in general and of British capitalism in particular, and it was people in different ways looking for an alternative. And Corbyn, because of his track record of anti-racism, of pro-trade unionism, of internationalism, his track record of being genuine and sincere and authentic, was able to become, and then an absolute historical fluke in terms of him being put on the ballot for the leadership race within Labour, and then the sort of energy that attracted from people looking for a political alternative. Corbyn got to sort of reflect and represent the massive demand that people were making in different ways for an alternative. People were looking out and reaching out for that. So they grew the Labour Party membership massively. I can't remember exactly what the figure was when Corbyn became leader, but they became the biggest social democratic party in Western Europe, certainly, up and around 500,000 members just before the election last year. Last week, it was reported that officially they've lost 57,000 members since Starmer took over, so about 10% of the membership. And as I understand it, it takes 6 months of lapsed subs before your actual membership is finally cancelled. So my suspicion is that it's probably closer to double that figure who have left since Starmer came in. That would be my sense of it. Now, the problem with that is there's no real formalised or structural vehicle outside of Labour on the British left. So the DSA, for example, is different. It exists alongside the Democratic Party, but outside it, and it can attract in people who have no sort of illusions in the Democratic Party. When people leave Labour, there's this sort of pool of small left-wing socialist sects, but there's no real formal base to sort of take people into and rebuild and refocus. So it will have a massive impact on the recomposition of socialist politics in Britain, definitely in the coming years. And again, I think, but the important thing there is that Starmer and co don't really care about membership numbers. Aside from the swelling the coffers and adding to sort of the resources they have at their disposal, they're not a party that is predisposed towards an active membership or a mass membership. You might be familiar with the work of Peter Mayer, who wrote a book called Ruling the Void a few years ago, which was all about the sort of double movement of political parties withdrawing from the electorate and the electorate withdrawing from political parties, and the emergence of technocratic governance and so forth. And Starmer's Labour is very much in that mold. So you can see him wooing corporate donors, trying to show himself to be the friend of business and so forth. So they'd be much happier, again, going back to a version of the Blair years model. They'll definitely take money off the trade unions if the unions will give it. They'll take money off the members, but they don't really care about the size of the membership base. And they can still rely on the fact that people who don't even like them hate the Tories even more. So they'll mobilise around elections and go out and campaign for them, even though they don't have much faith in them. And the second point about democratisation, that was actually one of the failings of the Corbyn era. They didn't go far enough in democratising the party. They didn't go far enough in challenging the inherited structures of how the party operated, whether that was in terms of internal elections and the composition of the NEC and so forth, or whether it was in terms of mandatory selections of candidates for general elections. And again, they didn't go far enough because they weren't the Stalinists that their enemies painted them as. And they also were very much wedded to this politics of Labourism. They didn't want to rock the boat. The threat of people like Chuka Umunna and others leaving to form another party, which they eventually did do, terrified Corbyn and co too much to actually push ahead with the radical changes that was needed. I may have said this when I was on last time, but I recall when Boris Johnson took over as leader of the Conservative Party, and the first thing he did is he kicked out a half dozen, probably a dozen MPs, including Winston Churchill's great-grandson. And the British media and the British political class were wringing their hands, including Labour MPs like Jess Phillips, who might as well be in the Conservative Party. They were wringing their hands going, this is terrible, how can you behave like this? And all I could think watching it was, if only Corbyn had a fraction of that, it could have been a very different last 5 years. But he didn't. It's not his disposition in terms of his politics, but also he didn't feel emboldened or empowered to do that because there wasn't a sufficiently strong extra parliamentary force to support him if he had done it. So yeah, unfortunately, on the democratising side of it, Corbyn didn't go far enough, and now Starmer and the people around him will consolidate. They changed the voting model for the NEC elections so that the right of the party were able to get some extra seats. I think 2 extra seats on the recent NEC elections, including a rabidly unpleasant and often Islamophobic individual who's a sort of figurehead for the Labour right, has been elected onto the NEC now. He actually got the highest number of votes of any individual member. So kind of tells you a little bit about the direction the party's going, and also the turnout for the NEC elections, which are a big deal in terms of Labour's internal democracy, was 23%, which again tells you about the direction of travel that the party's heading into.
Yeah, Jesus.
Mary and Joseph.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like us, y'all are dealing with, this horrific COVID crisis and, definite failures from the government. And before we broaden out the conversation for the last bit, I would like to hear your kind of read is like, how is, what is Starmer's Labour Party in opposition? How are they fighting against the Tories, or are they really putting up any opposition at all to what Boris Johnson is doing?
No, not in any meaningful sense. No, and again, it's part of So there's one thing I should say, and this is my assessment, and I think and I suspect that within Starmer's inner circle, it's their assessment as well. They're not going to win the next election. There's no feasible way in which they win the next general election. It would require them to win 128 seats, I think, which would be a bigger swing than ever happened under New Labour at their height. And they're not that popular, they're not that slick, they're not that well organised, and also the conjuncture is against them. So I think they know they're not going to win the next election. So they're not really lobbying for that. They're lobbying and working for the restoration of Labour's image as a responsible and reliable junior partner in the management of British capital. Now, I'll come back to COVID in a second, but you see that also in 2 recent pieces of legislation, one of which effectively excuses war crimes committed by British personnel overseas, and the other of which, called the Spy Cops Bill, which effectively empowers undercover police officers to commit criminal offences, including murder, rape, whatever it might be. Starmer's official line to his MPs was to abstain on this legislation, not to vote against it. So not to vote for it, but not to vote against it. Now, again, this is buying into vague notions of nationalism and so forth, and showing that they're strong and they'd push the button if they had to do it and so forth. So that's part of it. And on the COVID side, he's doing the same thing. So Starmer is trailing Johnson and is trying to, first and foremost, appease and satisfy the demands of British capital. So again, when the initial lockdown happened here, which was haphazard and wasn't done as well as it should have been, or executed as well as it should have been, Starmer was constantly on the airwaves saying, the government has to give us a strategy for coming out of lockdown. The government has to give us a strategy. So he was pushing this end lockdown line, because this was a line of a section of British capital, which was feeling the sort of pinch in the context of the lockdown. When the teachers' unions were coming out and saying that there are massive challenges and health considerations here, and if we reopen schools, it could lead to, the proliferation of cases and put teachers at risk and so forth, Starmer wouldn't support the teachers. Again, he was pushing the line, we need to find out how to unlock it. When the government introduced this scheme called Eat Out to Help Out, so that basically they subsidise people to go to cafes and restaurants, which again was another vector of the increasing spread of COVID, which has led to this second lockdown, Starmer and Labour supported this and sort of thought that this is a step in the right direction. When the Conservative government was refusing to back free school meals for children during the holidays whose parents are pressed and so forth, Labour were quite lukewarm on it until a professional football player or soccer player launched a campaign himself and really put pressure on everyone. And then Labour jumped on the coattails of that, because they could see that there was, Starmer's Labour, there were individual Labour members who were doing great work around that, but Starmer's Labour and the sort of PLP jumped on the coattails of that. So they're not offering any meaningful opposition, whether it's on the question of COVID or whether it's on any other sort of major policy issue. Now, what they are doing is raising questions of competence. So again, it's all about who would be the better manager. So they'll say, okay, we agree with what the government is doing with this easing the lockdown restrictions, but we would do it this way. Or do we have sufficient oversight for it? Or in terms of the procurement rules, there's been blatant profiteering and sort of almost sort of criminal nepotism with the Conservative Party in terms of handing out hundreds of millions to people with direct personal links or business links to the Conservative Party for PPE, for track and trace, for various things that have gone nowhere. I mean, literally, it's almost, it's almost like they're not even pretending anymore. And Starmer and others are making some noise about that, asking for accountability around this and greater transparency around the allocations of it. But there's no substantive alternative political vision, which again is something that Corbyn offered. Now, whether that was on again, I think it's important to stress that defending Corbyn isn't about Corbyn the individual, it's about the politics. But if you think about the individual, the day he was elected Labour Party leader, he went to a massive protest in London that was in solidarity with refugees and migrants. This was at a time when the right-wing media was, vilifying and sort of painting this image of hordes of migrants trying to invade the country. And Corbyn went straight there and expressed full solidarity with migrants. You think after the bombing in Manchester, when the easy tack was to come out and bang the drum and so forth, Corbyn came out and linked that bombing to British foreign policy and how that would produce these sort of events. So he offered an alternative vision, whatever other limitations. Starmer and co have no because they have no substantive differences in real terms with the Conservatives. It's just about who could manage British capital, who could manage on behalf of British capital more efficiently.
It can be sometimes difficult for me to talk about UK politics because I just go back like a year or two ago when there was all this excitement that we were going to have, Corbyn as, prime minister there and then potentially a Bernie Sanders presidency here. And, we are really dealing with a difficult moment on the left, which especially in the United States and the UK, that really does in a lot of ways mirror each other, where we thought we were actually breaking out of neoliberalism. And now this kind of that formation, people are writing obituaries for that system and that way of doing politics. And now it's, rising. And the Senate, at least here with, Joe Biden coming to power. I would, I know this is a bit of a general question, but I would be curious, what you think a kind of path forward for the left in the UK might be, specifically in relations to like, the trade unions there and the relationships with the Labour Party. And I would just like to say, and, add anything if you like to this too, especially for our American audience, I think sometimes there's a little bit of difficulty when you talk about, not you specifically, but people don't understand that being a Labour Party member versus potentially being a Labour voter, those are two very different things. In the United States, like our party structure is not that strong. Like I don't give the Democratic Party any money, right? In exchange to be able to vote for Bernie Sanders in a primary. This is different in the United Kingdom. You actually have to be much more involved and provide funds to the party as well.
Yeah. So in terms of the way forward, I mean, it's interesting. So for years, I've been involved here in Britain in various campaigns, whether it was around anti-austerity or more recently around Brexit and so forth. And it's been patently obvious, even at the height of the Corbyn moment, even in 2017, it was patently obvious that there was too much emphasis on parliamentarianism. There was too much emphasis on winning elections, and again, winning elections is important. That's part of the conflict we're involved in, but it was overemphasized to the detriment of other aspects of a broader Labour movement, lowercase L, as opposed to the Labour Party. And so, while the Labour membership increased massively to 500,000, there was no corresponding increase in trade union membership in Britain. There was also no corresponding increase in trade union militancy, really. My union, UCU, which represents university lecturers, we had a decent strike in 2018 and another one in 2019. But generally speaking, there hasn't been industrial unrest on the scale that there should be, given the nature of the inequality and poverty and sort of deep structural crisis in Britain. But also, political education has been lacking dramatically, not just in Britain, I think possibly in the US as well. You'll know it better than me.
No doubt.
But serious political education, developing the confidence, but also the critical and analytical capacity of grassroots activists hasn't been seen as a priority. Instead, different media platforms emerged and media personalities, which are seen as a substitute for doing the actual work of political education. The actual work of political education is long, slow, often tedious, but also very rewarding as well. To sort of put it in context, and I had this discussion recently with the UK branch of the DSA. So take the example of Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is very different from the US and very different from Britain. So, it's not a case of we can take that and bring it over here. But in Bolivia, a coup, a vicious military coup backed by the US and the EU and sort of Australia, the Western powers, overthrew the democratically elected government of Morales, forced him to flee, engaged in the assassination and murder of trade union activists and socialists and so on. And less than a year later, the movement reasserted itself, regained the political levers of power, and Morales is now back in Bolivia. They've deposed the sort of coup supporters within the military and so forth. Now, the thing with that is the MAS, where that came from, the MAS came from 30 years of social movement building in Bolivia. Actually, the MAS used to be a tiny right-wing party in Bolivia. And when the social movements in Bolivia became strong enough and wanted to contest elections, they needed a shell to be able to stand in elections because of Bolivia's system. So they referred to this as the political instrument. So they basically took over this party that had 6 members, an all right-wing party, and then called it, kept the name the MAS. And so the thing with the Bolivian experience is that it was a resilient movement that bounced back from a very serious attack and a very serious challenge because it was rooted in working class communities, because they do serious political education there. Oli Vargas, who's a journalist who covers this, he did a report a few months back on the political education they do, run through the trade unions and the social movements to build up leaders in the community, to empower them, to build up that confidence. Now, realistically, the left in Britain, and I suspect in certain ways the left in the US, needs to do something similar. We're in this process of recomposition. We're going to have here in the next year or two, again, this is a separate discussion, but the economic downturn we're about to experience was on the cards anyway, long before COVID popped up as a sort of conjunctural sort of trigger for it. This economic depression was sort of nascent before COVID accelerated it. What we're going to see in the next couple of years in Britain and in the US as well, we're going to see massive levels of persistent unemployment. We're going to see very serious threats to people's basic rights to have shelter. So there's going to have to be mass movements of unemployed workers. There's going to be mass movements around tenants' rights. They're going to have to be linked to the traditional labor struggles by sort of existing employed workers and mutual aid projects. We're going to have to break with models of charity and really build up this idea of solidarity and mutual aid. So I think that in Britain, what we're going to see of necessity is a lot of people who have learned the lessons of the Corbyn period, who understand the inherent limitations of parliamentarianism and the specific limitations of the Labour Party, will put more time and energy now into grassroots community organising, into trade union work and into political education. Now, this isn't as a sort of voluntarist alternative to electoralism. You can't escape the existing state apparatus, and we'll have to find ways of engaging that. But building independent sites of working class power, working class organisation, working class confidence is absolutely crucial. There's a Canadian comrade called Alan Sears, and he's done really good work on what he calls an infrastructure of dissent. So that basically in the past, whenever we built successful movements, it wasn't just with a party or with a union. We had in every area a local bookshop, a cafe, a church group, whatever it was. All these different centres provided stability and support that allowed us to build these movements. We need to rebuild that. We need to rebuild that in circumstances of lockdown and COVID and forms of employment, but we're not really in the workplace with our fellow workers for long periods of time. So the big challenges, but I think they're the key things: building an independent working class organisation, political education, and preparing people for, let's call it the fire next time, because there will be another opportunity. There'll be another Corbyn moment or another Sanders moment. We need to be better equipped before that comes around.
I think you're on it. I mean, one thing I've been trying to point out to people in the United States is like the only time we've ever had any kind of viable left-wing political movement or party, was following the populist movement, and then that became the People's Party, which then became the Socialist Party. And people should go back to the very beginning of that. And how it started was farmers were getting screwed over by merchants because we had a corrupt financial system that was making it impossible for them to get out of debt. And they got together and they started talking and they started educating themselves. And then they said, okay, we need to change the United States monetary policy. We need to push back against the Democrats. Anyways, it was like having that kind of class consciousness and social movement consciousness that then became, political parties. I understand everyone's sick, how sick we all are with the state of the Democratic Party and the Labour Party, but there's also this kind of fantasy that some people have that, if you just get the right banner and like a good slogan, that, the political party is just going to come out of nowhere. It's like, no, the people are going to be what's going to be needed to create the party.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that hits the nail on the head. And what you've just said there is a crucial point. I think there's nothing wrong with losing, right? It doesn't feel good. But if you're beaten and you lose a political fight, that can happen. The only real sin is to not learn from it. And so if you come out the other side of this round of electoralism and this sort of as clear and as pristine a demonstration as you could ask for of the nature of the capitalist state, the inherent limitations of reformism. So if you come out of that and your analysis is, we just need a different slogan or a different, or we need to get AOC out front next time. If that's your analysis, right, then you haven't really learned from what's happened. And you're right, we have to go back. So in Britain, we have to go back to the Chartist movement. If you're talking about the history of Britain, the Labour Party is actually a product of defeat. So the Chartist movement was far more radical, very much grounded in the working class communities and workplaces, far more of a threat to the British state and British capital. And it was defeated for a variety of reasons in 1848. And it's off the back of that, in the late 19th century, the new forms of unionism emerged, and then the sort of sections of the liberal political class melded with that and formed the Labour Party. But the Labour Party, much like the Democratic Party in the US, is a part of the state apparatus. Now, again, this is all about having these conversations about what is the state. The state isn't just police and courts, and the state power and the state apparatus is much more complicated than that. And the Labour Party, again, what the Corbyn period has shown, the Labour Party is part of the state apparatus. And you saw the way, as I mentioned to you before, the likes of Starmer, Thornbury, Jess Phillips, all of these people would have happily seen the Labour Party burn to the ground before they would see a moderate social democratic leader of their own party as prime minister. And that's because of the nature of state power, how that disciplines the nature of the class interest that their politics serves. So we having to go, we're not starting from zero. We don't have to sort of reinvent the wheel, but we have to learn the right lessons, and we have to revisit our histories. And also these examples from around the world. I think the Bolivian example is a really important one for everyone. Again, with the caveat that you can only take so much from what they've done there. But I think this is crucial. But I think at the same time, I'm not one for sort of willful optimism, because I don't think that does us any good. I think we have to be very sort of cold and clinical about understanding the scale of the challenge we face. But we also have to understand, and again, this is why political education is important, that this system will keep on throwing up crises, and that those crises will force people in one way or another to look for an alternative. Now, if what we're offering is reheated Obama or reheated Blair, well, then people won't want that alternative. And instead they'll be drawn to the sort of snake oil salesman of the right who, will blame migrants, will blame BME communities or whatever it is, and offer easy answers. Instead, we have to be in there challenging both the right and the sort of revanchist centre and offering a radical alternative. Because otherwise, in terms of climate crisis and everything else, the clock is ticking on us all here. So we have to really, there's the old slogan, we have to be as radical as reality itself, and we have to make that argument.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Paul, I really appreciate you joining us, and your insight is great. Thank you so much.
It's great to see you. Take care.
Great to see you too.
Great interview.
Thank you so much. I'll just add that if people weren't familiar with Paul coming on the show, this is somebody who was 100% right on Brexit and the growing storm that the Labour Party was facing when they were flip-flopping on that issue. So he's somebody whose advice you really should take seriously.
You really
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you really whetted my appetite for a history of the Chartist movement as well. It's interesting, like that is sort of, I guess, how we go back to the radical Republicans. Like this, we had our shit together in certain ways politically more 170 years ago or however long it is. But go ahead, Leisha.
Oh, I was saying this earlier offline, when he, had that imagery of like being thankful for being kicked and like a half-warmed Blair. He just really has like a great way of making these current conditions we're in very visceral and not always just in your mind, but you really feel the way he speaks. So I appreciated that. Yeah,
it's interesting because, how this developed with Corbyn getting reinstated. Because I remember talking about this last week, thinking, maybe the UK is a model for exit from, or at least like some kind of break from the Labour Party if Corbyn actually like wasn't instated, and like this does seem it's the standing of them adopting that definition.
Mm-hmm. And like they've been very successful, as we mentioned earlier, at punishing members of the party for breaking the, not towing the line, including on like disgusting rules like not being able to prosecute members of the military for crimes against humanity. I mean, something that like a left party should actually be able to do, even if they're not interested in challenging like the capital structures.
Like, what do you do if you're in England? Like, you can't really join the SNP or like Plaid Cymru or like what's the English party? There's like Lib Dems suck too.
Oh yeah,
horrible options electorally.
Well, I have a new cheers. You have to be more radical than reality itself.
Yeah, that's a good one. This has got a deep history behind it too.
Yeah. Are we gonna do some announcements? Are we gonna do some Peru?
I think we'll do announcements first, right?
All right.
Yeah, I guess I'll say before Alicia goes, David and I will have an announcement to make. And next Tuesday will be a big announcement show, basically. So the announcements will be then. So we're announcing an announcement show. And David and I will have an announcement show. And Alicia, you can kind of also give them a hint of what to expect on the channel here.
What to expect when you're
this winter.
Yeah, I think next week we'll get more into depth. So definitely tune in because we have a bunch of exciting stuff to talk about. But one thing we just wanted to let out of the bag early is for the month of December, we're going to be doing this Michael Brooks tribute, which Professor Russell Spriglia, I'm 90% sure I said his last name correctly, has been really a champion in putting on, and we're really excited about it. I think we're going to be starting things off with a conversation between Slavoj Žižek. How'd I do?
Slavoj. It is good though. You got the last name right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
I haven't gotten the Slavoj. That's
okay,
a new
Slavoj.
That's new to me as well too. Slavoj.
And they're going to be talking about the future of the left and their time on TMBS, and there's honestly like just an all-star panel of people. So yeah, tune in next Tuesday for more information on that and some other exciting announcements.
All right, David, Peru.
Yeah, y'all. This is so we talked about this last week, what was going on in Peru, and I sort of went through a breakdown as to why this was so important, the kind of presidential crisis that they were having there, while also making clear the dynamics at play on the ground. Well, there's been more developments since then, so I just want to fill people in. Last Sunday, the interim president, Manuel Merino, who, as we talked about last week, basically asserted himself to become the next, to become the president of Peru through a lot of, kind of BS, trickery and some pretty loose interpretations of the Constitution. That led to massive protests and people in the streets, social movements, bravely standing up against a very heavily armed and quite brutal and violent state apparatus and police force. But on Sunday, he stepped down, and Peru has a new interim president, President Francisco Sagasti, who again is a centrist, but is somebody who is coming into power after the people rose up in opposition to this very clear congressional and legislative coup against the elected president. So that's a huge victory, like a serious victory, and we should not belittle that at all for the social movements. I mean, people went out there and stood up against a very horrific and dubious attempt to completely subvert democracy in the country. In fact, two protesters, Jack Pintado, who was shot 10 times by police, and Jordan Sotelo was also killed, and shot by the police there. So people went out and they fought and they laid down their life to preserve democracy in Peru, which, for people who aren't familiar with, is a country that just very recently in our lifetime had lived through a horrific dictatorship, whose party, by the way, still has seats in the government. So that kind of danger is not put away, but it was a significant victory to basically push back against an extremely anti-democratic movement that we saw there. It should be noted again, though, that the country is suffering immensely under the COVID crisis. It's been hit, not only one of the worst countries in the area, hit horribly health-wise, but economically the country is in shambles. It's a little bit worrying, of course, that the keys are being handed over to a kind of centrist like Sagasti, who somebody who spent not an insignificant amount of time working at the World Bank. So we'll see what happens. It looks like he's expected to serve out the rest of this term until July of next year. Well, there'll be new presidential elections in April. So definitely congratulations and solidarity to all the people who went out there and fought tooth and nail to prevent a really horrific, undemocratic, right-wing coup of the country.
Yeah, inspiring. I mean, South America, people power. Examples. It's nice. I think it's good that people are. I don't like to completely downplay what's been going on here. I think but it is just when the things are synchronized with actual particularly in Bolivia, when things are synchronized with political leadership, it's pretty very inspiring. I say, particularly in insanely dark times. And it also makes me wonder what the fuck Fukuyama was thinking in the 90s. Just this, the entire, the year, I guess, but Jesus.
We should do an in-depth.
We need to get
Bressner
on.
We should. I'd love to do that because Fukuyama. For people who aren't familiar, he's the one who wrote the famous end of history thesis that basically liberal democracy and neoliberal capitalism was the highest synthesis of human society, and that history in the sense of human struggle, class struggle was over, and it was quite a triumphant moment. I'll just say my quick line on it though, because I actually find it really interesting because obviously it's hilarious to laugh at him. He was definitely wrong, and we've seen that played out over the past few years. But he definitely captured the psychology of the moment, and I actually think the inverse of the triumphant, Fukuyama was triumphant because he was a conservative. He thought this was good, right? The inverse of Fukuyama is left pessimism, right? This, or what Mark Fisher is writing about, this idea that nothing good will ever happen again, right? It was something that infected our minds too. So even though he was wrong, he definitely did capture a genuine feeling that people were having.
Yeah, that was the internet. I felt feeling of everything. Yeah, the Clear Channel controlled every radio station. I remember because the only way that was the cultural feeling. Whether it was true economically or politically, it felt real. It felt everything's been done before music wise, right?
Yeah.
Right. Which is just insane, knowing every type of advancement. It's basically because the Strokes are doing garage rock again. It's you can kind of, innovate, but pretty much everything's been done. And you kind of just, and yeah, not so much. Really, I could do without dubstep and the current fascist GOP,
and how they are linked in Silicon Valley.
Right? Yeah.
This is a little bit of a little PBS of me, but I want to just wish everyone a happy. Well, no, it's not PBS. It's nice. Things that are nice don't have to be PBS. PBS has taken a nosedive into the not nice. I can't associate those things. But I want to wish everyone a happy Diwali. I think I'm saying that correctly. Festival of Delights. That was definitely on Michael's bucket list to go to India and take part in that. And I know we have a lot of TMBS community members in India, and here in the US. So wishing you happy holidays.
Very nice.
Well, before we cut out too, I was going to do a quick update on Bolivia, sort of, because this is some good news. I don't know if you have those things prepped up, but I can introduce them.
I got
it's just
3. Yep.
Look, we got good news, man, and we got to celebrate and also learn, because this is a great moment where we have a lot to learn from the left movements in Bolivia. The first one here, Matt, if you have it, is just great news. So we already saw Evo return triumphantly to Bolivia, but we can officially say. Oh, actually, you need to go up. It's not the clip. It's just the breaking news. But he officially now is, after a meeting of 9 departmental leaders, he is again the president of the Movement for Socialism. So it's a beautiful return for Evo. And there's a great little talk that he gives that you can check out here on Telesur, but it's a little bit long and it's subtitled. And we already have another one that I wanted to get to. And if you could put this on, because this is exactly why Evo Morales was such a threat to the system and why it's such an incredible moment that he is not only back in the country, but is back leading these social movements. Again, I'm sorry for people who are listening. This is definitely a video, but we have subtitles of a speech that Evo gave very recently on why they came after him and and why nationalization is the way forward.
Gracias, se tardan años y años. Y para que vuelva la izquierda, a veces se olvidan. Un solo ejemplo, hace 12 años, un golpe de Estado en Honduras. 12 años, hasta ahora no pueden recuperar y nosotros en un año ya recuperamos la democracia, por tanto nuestro proceso de cambio vuelve al gobierno.
Yeah, and in that later, he says that, which is a great line, that nationalization is the program of the people, privatization is the program of the gringos, imperialists, and capitalists. So an absolutely beautiful and triumphant return for Evo Morales, and we're happy to see it. We don't often get good news, and just seriously, there's a lot of lessons that we can learn from. As Paul was saying, it's not a one for one. We can't mimic, the Moss in the United States, for example. But there's a lot to be learned for how successful social movements can be. Yeah, and this last, sorry, Matt, this last bit too is something that's also very exciting to just see. They have been able to, and this is something I was saying after the elections came out. This was top of the list. Was that you needed military reform. But Luis Arce has sworn in a new set of military generals. Right-wing factions that were loyal to the U.S.-backed coup have been removed. And that's just incredible. One, obviously, for the protection of the victories in Bolivia. But two, just to show how much power this movement has come in, that they're already able to sort of purge the military of those, figures who, attacked democracy and sided with, United States imperialism and right-wing fascism in Bolivia.
Yeah. I mean,
it's good. I mean, it's just like good news. So
especially on the day where Biden's saying, we're kind of going to turn the page on the Trump administration. And as Trump is like installing his guys in the DOD and like, look, if they pull troops out of Afghanistan, fine. I got a feeling that those guys are in there to do a little bit more than that. But that said, take the troops out. Let's get out there. But yeah, I mean, quite a different approach to the deep state going on in Bolivia.
I think my high school social studies teacher, who had a little crush on Hugo Chavez, might have a new crush.
I mean, Evo's worthy.
Oh, he 100%.
We've lost contact, but I could see if I could find a Facebook or something.
That'd be a funny one, a message to send to somebody after a year.
Remember me?
All right, folks. I think patrons, we'll see you in about a half hour at 9 p.m. Eastern time for the post game. And
we're going to have Dr. Eric Osgood on, and he's going to be giving us a bit of a perspective on what we should know, actually, good information about COVID, and also some more information about it in a global context and what's happening out of the U.S.
Cool. All right.
Wonderful. All right. See y'all.
Bye.